The blue flames of the ceremonial torch danced in the darkness of the veterans' hall as Commander pulled his weathered cloak around his carapace. The younger gathered in a semicircle before him, their compound eyes gleaming with curiosity and naive excitement about war stories. If only they knew what nightmares awaited those who faced humanity in battle. His mandibles clicked nervously as he began his tale, his voice carrying the weight of countless sleepless cycles. The scars across his chitinous armor told their own story, but the mental wounds ran far deeper than any plasma burn could reach. The first encounter happened during the Battle of Station, when the Galactic Coalition still believed humans were just another primitive species that had stumbled into space travel. The intelligence reports painted them as weak, soft-skinned creatures who relied too heavily on their crude technology. Every civilized species in the galaxy had similar assessments. Humans appeared to have no natural weapons, no armored skin, no enhanced physical capabilities that marked true warriors. Commander remembered the confidence that filled the Third Fleet as they approached human-controlled space. Their ships were technological marvels compared to the clunky human vessels. Plasma cannons could slice through asteroids, while their quantum shields had never been breached by any known weapon. The humans had only been in space for a few hundred rotations, barely long enough to establish proper colonies. The attack began at dawn on Station's artificial day cycle. Commanded a strike force of 12 heavy cruisers, each carrying enough firepower to level a moon. Intelligence suggested the human garrison consisted of maybe 3,000 soldiers with outdated equipment. It should have been a simple operation: destroy the station, capture any survivors for interrogation, and move on to the next target. Everything went wrong from the first moment of contact. The human ships didn't behave like any civilized military force. Instead of forming proper battle lines or attempting to negotiate surrender terms, they immediately scattered in seemingly random directions. Tactical doctrine emphasized organized formations and coordinated firepower, but these humans moved like a swarm of angry insects with no apparent strategy. Ordered his fleet to pursue the fleeing human vessels, confident that their superior speed would make short work of the primitive craft. The first human ship they caught was a small frigate that had seemingly suffered engine failure. As the cruiser moved in for the kill, the human vessel suddenly exploded in a massive nuclear detonation that completely destroyed its lead ship and damaged 3 others. The humans had turned their own ship into a weapon. No civilized species would sacrifice themselves so readily, especially not for a tactical advantage that barely delayed the inevitable. Commanders were trained to preserve their forces and fight efficiently. This reckless self-destruction made no sense according to any known military doctrine. But that was only the beginning of the humans' insanity. The remaining human ships didn't continue fleeing as expected. Instead, they regrouped and began attacking with a ferocity that all logic. Their weapons were indeed primitive by standards, but they used them in ways that no sane being would consider. One human destroyer rammed directly into a cruiser, detonating both ships in a spectacular explosion. Another human captain somehow managed to overload his ship's reactor and use it as a massive bomb, taking out 2 more vessels. The humans were fighting like cornered predators rather than a rational military force. They showed no concern for their own survival, no attempt to minimize casualties, no effort to preserve valuable equipment. Every engagement became a life-or-death struggle where humans seemed willing to trade their lives for even minor tactical advantages. His confidence began to crumble as his superior fleet found itself evenly matched against supposedly inferior human forces. The humans' willingness to sacrifice everything made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that no tactical manual had prepared him for. Every time his forces thought they had gained an advantage, the humans would do something completely irrational that turned the battle around. The ground assault on Station proved even more horrifying than the space battle. Troops were genetically engineered for combat, with natural armor plating and enhanced strength that made them superior to most species soldiers. Their powered armor could deflect most energy weapons, and their plasma rifles could cut through virtually any known material. The human defenders should have surrendered immediately when faced with such overwhelming physical superiority. Instead, they fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. Led the assault personally, confident that his veteran troops would quickly overwhelm the human garrison. The station's outer defenses fell easily enough, but as his forces penetrated deeper into the facility, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance. The humans had turned every corridor into a killing field, every room into a trap. What shocked most was how the humans adapted their tactics in real time. When plasma rifles proved superior in open combat, the humans immediately switched to close quarters fighting where their smaller size and agility gave them advantages. When their standard weapons couldn't penetrate armor, they improvised explosive devices and chemical weapons that no civilized army would use. The humans showed no respect for the accepted rules of warfare. They targeted medical facilities, used civilians as shields, and employed psychological warfare that violated every galactic convention. One group of human soldiers had barricaded themselves in the station's reactor core, threatening to detonate it and kill everyone aboard rather than surrender. As the battle raged through the station's corridors, began to understand why the humans fought so differently. They weren't just defending a military installation, they were protecting their home. Every human on the station, from the youngest civilian to the oldest soldier, seemed willing to die rather than allow their territory to be conquered. This level of attachment to a specific location was completely alien to psychology. When faced with superior force, rational beings would relocate to more defensible positions or negotiate terms that preserved their population. The humans instead chose to fight for every meter of deck plating, as if the station itself held some sacred significance. The final assault on the station's command center became a nightmare that would haunt for the rest of his life. His remaining troops had to fight through sections where the humans had deliberately breached the hull, creating vacuum zones that claimed as many human lives as one's. The human commander, a female named Captain Martinez, continued directing the defense even after losing an arm to plasma fire. Once forces finally cornered the surviving human defenders in the command center, he expected them to surrender. Instead, Captain Martinez activated the station's self-destruct sequence and informed him that everyone aboard had exactly 10 minutes to evacuate before the reactor went critical. The humans had chosen mutual annihilation over defeat. Barely escaped with half his original force, and the destruction of station sent shockwaves through the Galactic Coalition's military hierarchy. The humans hadn't just won a tactical victory, they had demonstrated that they would rather die than be conquered. This revelation changed everything about how the galaxy viewed humanity as a potential threat. Sitting in the Veterans Hall, surrounded by young who had never faced humans in combat, his compound eyes dimmed with remembered horror. The Battle of Station had been his first encounter with humanity's terrifying resolve, but it would not be his last. The humans had only grown more dangerous as the war progressed, developing new tactics and technologies that every assumption about civilized warfare. The young soldiers listening to his story shifted uncomfortably, their earlier excitement replaced by growing unease. They had expected tales of glorious victory and tactical brilliance, not accounts of an enemy so ruthless that they would destroy themselves to deny their opponents any advantage. His mandibles clicked once more as he prepared to continue his tale. The first encounter with humanity had been shocking enough, but the subsequent battles would reveal depths of human determination that no alien species was prepared to face. The galaxy had learned too late that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. The ceremonial flames flickered lower as Commander paused in his recounting, his carapace reflecting the dying light. The young before him had grown silent, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by a creeping dread as they began to understand the true nature of their ancient enemies. But the worst was yet to come. The second encounter that would forever change understanding of human warfare occurred during the siege of 18 cycles after the destruction of Station. By then, the Galactic Coalition had learned to take humanity seriously as a military threat, but they still fundamentally misunderstood what made humans so dangerous in combat. The Coalition High Command had decided to demonstrate their overwhelming superiority by laying siege to humanity's second most important star system. The plan was methodical and thorough. Surround the system with a massive fleet, cut off all supply lines, and wait for the humans to surrender when their resources ran out. No bombardment, no direct assault, just a slow, patient strangulation that would prove the futility of human resistance. Had been promoted to Fleet Admiral after his costly victory at Station, and he commanded the 7th Battle Group in the blockade. The coalition forces numbered over 800 capital ships from 12 different species, representing the largest military operation in galactic history. Against this overwhelming force, the humans had perhaps 50 warships and a few dozen orbital defense platforms. The mathematics were simple. The humans would run out of food, fuel, and ammunition within 6 months. No rational leadership would allow their population to starve when surrender remained an option. The coalition fleet settled in for what they expected to be a brief and decisive campaign. The humans had other plans. Instead of conserving their resources and preparing for inevitable surrender, the human defenders immediately began launching desperate attacks against the blockade fleet. Their strikes were surgical and precise, targeting supply ships and isolated patrol groups with a coordination that impressed even veteran coalition commanders. But what truly terrified their enemies was the humans' complete disregard for acceptable loss ratios. A typical engagement would see 3 or 4 human ships attack a coalition patrol group of 20 vessels. By any reasonable military standard, such an attack was suicidal. The humans would lose most or all of their ships while inflicting minimal damage on the superior enemy force. But the humans kept launching these pointless attacks with mechanical regularity, never seeming to learn from their massive casualties. Began to realize that the humans weren't trying to win individual battles. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that couldn't afford to lose ships at the same rate. Every coalition vessel destroyed represented months of construction time and irreplaceable trained personnel. Every human ship lost was immediately replaced by civilian craft hastily converted for combat. The humans were treating their own lives as just another resource to be expended for strategic advantage. As the siege dragged on beyond the 6-month projection, strange reports began filtering in from coalition intelligence officers. The humans weren't rationing their supplies or implementing emergency conservation measures as expected. Instead, they had somehow increased their industrial output despite being cut off from external resources. The orbital factories around were working at maximum capacity, producing weapons and ships at a rate that should have been impossible with their limited raw materials. Coalition scientists couldn't understand how the humans were maintaining such production levels without access to the rare elements and complex components that modern manufacturing required. The answer, when it finally emerged, was typical of human ingenuity and horrifying in its implications. The humans had begun systematically dismantling their own civilian infrastructure to feed their war machine. Luxury goods, civilian electronics, even basic life support systems were being stripped for components and raw materials. The human population was voluntarily reducing their standard of living to medieval levels in order to continue fighting. But even this sacrifice wasn't enough to explain the humans' sustained resistance. Coalition analysts estimated that even with total resource conversion, the human war effort should have collapsed within 18 months. The siege was now approaching its 3rd year, and human attacks were actually increasing in frequency and effectiveness. Led several reconnaissance missions into the outer system to investigate these disturbing reports. What his forces discovered challenged every assumption about human society and psychology. The humans had transformed their entire civilization into a military apparatus, with every citizen contributing to the war effort in ways that no other species would tolerate. Children as young as 8 years old were working in weapons factories, operating machinery that would be considered too dangerous for adult civilians in any civilized society. Elderly humans who should have been retired were serving as combat engineers and strategic planners. Even the sick and injured were contributing their skills to military research and intelligence analysis. The humans had achieved something that coalition psychologists had deemed impossible. They had voluntarily transformed their entire society into a totalitarian war machine without losing their individual initiative and creativity. Every human seemed to understand that their personal survival depended on their species' military victory, and they acted accordingly. But the most disturbing discovery was the humans' approach to prisoner exchanges and medical treatment. Coalition forces had captured several thousand human prisoners during the siege, expecting to use them as bargaining chips for favorable surrender terms. The human response was to immediately classify all captured personnel as expendable and cease any rescue attempts. Human military doctrine had been updated to assume that any captured soldier was effectively dead and would not be recovered. This eliminated the coalition's ability to use prisoners as leverage and freed human commanders from any need to consider rescue operations when planning attacks. The humans had simply written off their own people to deny their enemies any psychological advantage. Similarly, wounded human soldiers were given basic medical treatment and then immediately returned to combat duty regardless of their condition. Humans missing limbs, suffering from radiation poisoning, or recovering from severe injuries were pressed back into service with crude prosthetics and stimulant drugs. The human military had decided that a partially functional soldier was more valuable than a properly healed civilian. This approach to human resources was so alien to coalition thinking that many commanders initially refused to believe the intelligence reports. The idea that any species would deliberately sacrifice their own people's welfare for marginal military advantages violated every principle of civilized warfare. But the evidence was overwhelming. Humans valued victory more than they valued individual lives, including their own. The siege's turning point came during the Battle of the Asteroid Fields, when human engineers demonstrated their most terrifying capability, the ability to weaponize literally anything. Coalition forces had detected unusual activity in the asteroid belt and sent a battle group to investigate. They expected to find mining operations or hidden military bases. Instead, they discovered that the humans had been slowly moving asteroids into carefully calculated orbits around the system's primary star. When the coalition fleet approached, the humans activated hidden rocket motors on dozens of massive rocks and sent them hurtling toward the blockade fleet at incredible speeds. The kinetic energy of these improvised weapons was devastating. Asteroids weighing millions of tons struck coalition ships with the force of nuclear bombs, penetrating shields and armor that had never been breached by conventional weapons. The humans had turned their own solar system into a massive artillery battery using nothing but basic rocket technology and precise orbital mechanics. But even more disturbing was the realization that this attack had been in preparation for years, long before the siege began. The humans had anticipated being blockaded and had spent decades positioning asteroids for this exact scenario. Their planning horizon extended far beyond what any other species considered reasonable for military preparation. The coalition fleet was forced to withdraw from their carefully planned blockade positions to avoid the continuing asteroid bombardment. This gave the human defenders the opportunity they had been waiting for, a chance to break the siege through direct assault. The final battle lasted for 72 hours and cost both sides enormous casualties. But by the end, the coalition blockade had been broken, and the surviving human forces had achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history. They had defeated a vastly superior enemy through sheer determination and tactical innovation. As news of the coalition's failure spread throughout the galaxy, other species began to reassess their relationship with humanity. The humans had proven that they could not be conquered through conventional military means, no matter how overwhelming the force arrayed against them. Any war with humanity would be a war of extermination, with no possibility of negotiated settlement or conditional surrender. His compound eyes reflected the dying flames as he paused again in his narrative. The young around him were no longer fidgeting with excitement. They sat in stunned silence, beginning to comprehend the true horror of facing an enemy that would rather die than yield. But even the siege of was not the worst encounter had experienced with human forces. The final phase of his military career would bring him face to face with humanity's ultimate weapon, their ability to inspire other species to fight with the same desperate courage that had made humans so terrifying. When humans began forming alliances with other races, they didn't just share their technology, they shared their philosophy of total warfare. The galaxy would never be the same after humanity taught other species that sometimes the only rational response to an overwhelming enemy was to become irrational yourself. The ceremonial flames had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the features of Commander as he prepared to recount the final chapter of his military service. The young gathered before him had lost all trace of their earlier enthusiasm for war stories. They now understood that they were hearing the testimony of a survivor, not the boasts of a conqueror. The third and most devastating encounter with human forces occurred during what historians would later call the Alliance War, when humanity's philosophy of total warfare spread like a plague across the galaxy. This conflict began 15 cycles after the siege of, when several minor species approached humanity seeking military alliance against expansion. The Galactic Coalition had always maintained order through a careful balance of power between major species, with smaller civilizations serving as buffer zones and resource providers. This system had kept peace for thousands of cycles, ensuring that conflicts remained limited and manageable. The humans threatened this stability by offering smaller species something the Coalition never had: genuine partnership instead of subordination. Commanded the Second Fleet when the Alliance War erupted across 17 star systems simultaneously. Intelligence reports suggested that humanity had formed military pacts with 6 minor species: the Crystalline Collective, the Aquatic Nereid Republics, the Mechanical Construct Assemblies, the Fungal Spore Networks, the Energy-Based Clusters, and the Hive Confederations. The Coalition High Command was confident that this alliance would collapse quickly under pressure. These species had fundamental biological and cultural differences that made long-term cooperation impossible. Previous attempts at multi-species alliances had always failed due to incompatible military doctrines, communication barriers, and conflicting strategic objectives. The humans had somehow solved all these problems by teaching their allies to fight like humans. The first signs of this disturbing development appeared during the Battle of Vega Minor, where a mixed human fleet engaged forces in what should have been a routine colonial pacification. They had always been passive traders who avoided military conflict through diplomacy and economic concessions. Their crystal ships were beautiful but fragile, designed for cargo transport rather than combat. The vessels that attacked fleet bore no resemblance to traditional crystal ships. These craft had been reinforced with human armor plating and equipped with human weapon systems, but more importantly, they were being operated according to human tactical doctrine. When the battle turned against them, the captains immediately began ramming ships instead of attempting to withdraw. The crystalline beings were committing suicide attacks with the same casual determination that humans displayed. This behavior was completely contrary to everything known about psychology and military tradition. Somehow, the humans had convinced an entire species to abandon their survival instincts and fight with reckless desperation. But they were just the beginning. Each of humanity's alliance partners had adopted human military philosophy and adapted it to their unique capabilities. The aquatic Nereids used their underwater cities as massive torpedo launchers, firing salvos of kinetic projectiles from ocean depths where no conventional weapon could reach them. When their worlds were bombarded from orbit, the Nereids simply moved their entire civilization underwater and continued fighting from submarine bases. The mechanical constructs proved even more disturbing in their adaptation of human tactics. These artificial beings had always been logical and predictable, following programmed behavioral patterns that made them easy to counter in combat. After forming alliance with humanity, the constructs began exhibiting chaotic and unpredictable responses that their original programming. Individual construct units would sacrifice themselves to protect damaged human ships, displaying loyalty behavior that their creators had never installed. Entire construct fleets would self-destruct to deny strategic positions to enemy forces, mimicking human willingness to choose mutual annihilation over defeat. The machines had somehow learned to value victory over self-preservation. The fungal spore networks represented perhaps the most horrifying transformation of all. These creatures had traditionally been peaceful gardeners who terraformed worlds through careful biological manipulation. Their military contribution had always been limited to defensive biological warfare using non-lethal toxins and hallucinogenic agents. Under human influence, the spore networks weaponized their entire biological arsenal. They began releasing aggressive fungal strains that could dissolve armor plating, deploying spore clouds that caused permanent madness in exposed personnel, and most terrifyingly, creating biological weapons specifically designed to target genetics. The humans had convinced the spore networks to abandon every ethical restraint that had previously limited their military capabilities. These peaceful gardeners were now creating weapons of biological warfare that violated every galactic convention on acceptable combat methods. As the Alliance War spread across more star systems, began to recognize a pattern in human alliance building that explained their unprecedented success. The humans weren't just sharing technology with their partners, they were fundamentally changing how these species thought about warfare and survival. Traditional coalition military doctrine emphasized efficiency, predictability, and preservation of resources. Battles were fought according to established rules that minimized casualties and prevented conflicts from escalating beyond controllable levels. This approach had maintained galactic stability for. Human military philosophy rejected every one of these principles. Humans taught their allies that efficiency was less important than determination, that unpredictability was more valuable than superior technology, and that some objectives were worth any sacrifice. They convinced entire species to abandon the rational calculation of costs and benefits that had always governed interstellar warfare. The humans were spreading military madness like a contagious disease. The decisive battle of the Alliance War occurred at the fortress world of Rigel Prime, where the Coalition had concentrated their most powerful defensive installations. The planet was protected by orbital weapons platforms that could destroy entire fleets, energy shields that could withstand sustained bombardment, and ground-based fortress complexes that had never been successfully assaulted. The Alliance attack on Rigel Prime began with a coordinated assault by all 6 allied species, each contributing their unique capabilities to a strategy that no single species could have executed alone. The energy-based phased through the orbital defenses to disable them from within. The Hive confederations swarmed the planet's surface in numbers that overwhelmed automated defense systems. The mechanical constructs established beachheads for human assault troops, while they provided orbital fire support. But the most devastating contribution came from the spore networks and the Nereids, who had developed a joint biological warfare capability that specifically targeted the life support systems of underground fortress complexes. Their combined attack rendered Rigel Prime's most secure installations uninhabitable within hours, forcing the defenders to abandon positions that had been considered impregnable. The fall of Rigel Prime sent shockwaves through the Coalition that went far beyond its military significance. For the first time in galactic history, a multi-species alliance had successfully coordinated their unique capabilities to achieve a strategic objective that none of them could have accomplished individually. The humans had proven that cooperation was possible between species with fundamentally different biologies and cultures. More importantly, the humans had demonstrated that their philosophy of total warfare could be successfully transmitted to other species without destroying their individual characteristics. Each allied species retained their unique cultural identity while adopting human tactical ruthlessness. This combination created military capabilities that were both unpredictable and terrifyingly effective. Its final engagement with human forces came during the desperate Coalition counterattack that attempted to recapture the Rigel system. The High Command had authorized the use of their most powerful weapons, including planet-killing Nova bombs that could sterilize entire star systems. The plan was to demonstrate that the Coalition retained overwhelming destructive capability and force the Alliance to accept negotiated settlement. The human response was to immediately threaten retaliation against Coalition using captured weapons, and improvise that their engineers had constructed from salvaged materials. But more significantly, the humans announced that they would rather see their own worlds destroyed than accept any peace terms that didn't include complete Coalition withdrawal from disputed territories. The Alliance species supported this position unanimously, despite the fact that it meant accepting the potential destruction of their own. The humans had convinced their allies that some principles were worth dying for, even if it meant the extinction of their entire species. Faced with an enemy that preferred mutual annihilation to conditional surrender, the Coalition High Command was forced to accept humanity's terms. The alternative was a war of extermination that would devastate the entire galaxy and leave no victors among the survivors. Sitting in the Veterans Hall, surrounded by the dying flames of the ceremonial torches, Commander concluded his tale with a warning that still haunted him after all these cycles. The humans had changed the fundamental nature of galactic warfare by proving that determination could overcome technological superiority, that cooperation between species was possible, and most terrifyingly, that rational beings could choose to become irrational when the stakes were high enough. The young before him absorbed this lesson in stunned silence. They had entered the hall expecting to hear stories of glorious conquest and military adventure. Instead, they had learned that their species' greatest enemies were not aliens with superior weapons or advanced technology. They were creatures who refused to accept defeat under any circumstances and could convince others to share their deadly philosophy. The Alliance War had ended with humanity and their partners controlling nearly a third of known space, protected by mutual defense treaties that made any attack on one species equivalent to declaring war on all of them. The coalition had been forced to accept a new balance of power that recognized humanity's right to exist as equals rather than subordinates, but knew that the real victory belonged to the humans' ideas rather than their territory. Across the galaxy, other species were beginning to ask themselves whether they would rather live as subjects of more powerful neighbors or fight for the right to determine their own destiny. The human philosophy of total warfare was spreading beyond the formal alliance, inspiring independence movements and resistance cells that challenged the old order. The galaxy would never again be the safe, predictable place it had been before humanity emerged from their small blue world to teach other species that sometimes the only rational response to overwhelming odds was to become willing to die rather than surrender. This lesson, once learned, could never be forgotten or unlearned. As the ceremonial flames finally died and the Veterans Hall fell into darkness, rose slowly from his speaker's platform. The young soldiers before him filed out in contemplative silence, their dreams of military glory replaced by a deeper understanding of what warfare truly meant when conducted by beings who valued freedom more than life itself. The human legacy lived on in every species that had learned to fight for principles rather than just territory, in every military doctrine that prioritized determination over efficiency, and in every commander who understood that the most dangerous enemy was one with nothing left to lose. Humanity had won their war not through superior technology or numbers, but by teaching the galaxy that some things were worth any sacrifice to defend.